Finally, my Lords, there is unfinished business on building safety and leasehold reform. On leasehold, who can forget the impassioned contributions from Lord Kennedy in the last Parliament to abolish this feudal system? And his most recent one was actually less than 2 months ago on May the 24th. And this is what he said: I certainly hope that whoever is in power, the necessary action is taken and the leaseholder problems are dealt with. So his hopes were met with a draft bill, which I welcome. But there is a particular problem facing leaseholders in blocks with safety issues post-Grenfell, which cannot wait, and it's an issue on which I and others campaigned in the last Parliament. Of the 4,329 buildings identified with unsafe cladding, over half had not started remediation at the end of March this year, 7 years after Grenfell. Only 23%, 976 buildings, have completed remediation work. Now, the manifesto says, I quote, Labour will also take decisive action to improve building safety. So can the Minister outline what decisive action they will take to help the many thousands of leaseholders who are in difficulties, living in unsafe buildings, facing bankruptcy, facing repossession, and also those living in blocks under 11 metres who get no help from the Building Safety Act? I know that Baroness Taylor understands the problem, and I hope that she can make progress. So, my Lords, there is much to be done. I wish the government well, and I shall provide the same critical support to this government as I did to the last one.
And there is no worse example of what happens when government stops listening to people and transparency and accountability is discarded than what happened at Grenfell Tower over 7 years ago. 72 people lost their lives in an entirely preventable tragedy, and yet we still do not have truth, justice and change for the bereaved, survivors and affected community. These are people whose lives were changed forever on the 14th of June 2017, and who have had to wait far too long for justice and for those responsible to be held to account. In the coming weeks, the second phase of the public inquiry will report, and I know honourable members here will join me in looking to those recommendations to ensure that a tragedy like Grenfell can never happen again. And I warmly welcome the inclusion of the duty of candour law for public servants in the King's Speech, and applaud the effective campaigning from those affected by Grenfell, Hillsborough, infected blood, Windrush and others who have suffered from an unacceptable defensive culture across many of our public institutions. And I hope we can look at further measures to ensure robust oversight of the implementation of those recommendations from these inquiries.
The post office scandal reveals a wider problem, it seems to me, of British society, whether it's Orgreave, Grenfell, contaminated blood, or the problems at Hillsborough. The British establishment seems incapable of listening to the voices of ordinary people. Will you raise this matter with other ministers and see whether there's a way of this government ensuring that that isn't repeated in the future?
I think there is a question of political accountability for decisions that are taken and actions and inactions that take place over many years, and certainly we will be reflecting on how best to make sure that there is genuine political accountability in this system.
There are many people in cases that would benefit from a Hillsborough law. I've had the privilege of hearing directly from people affected by a range of scandals and tragedies, including the post office harassment scandal, Grenfell, COVID-19, the truth about Zayn, nuclear test veterans, Manchester Arena bombing, infected blood scandal and hormone pregnancy tests. And what was clear in all these cases and many more is that the Hillsborough playbook has been used time and time again by public servants and institutions who are still allowed to withhold the truth and lie about their actions and blame victims for their own failures and mistakes. That is why a full Hillsborough law is urgently needed, with the legal duty of candour on all public bodies and parity of legal representation to ensure the scales of justice will be balanced.
We can't ignore any longer the failings exposed by the infected blood inquiry, the post office scandal, Windrush, Hillsborough, Grenfell, and now the COVID report. nor can we excuse them as isolated historic incidents. We need to show, if we're going to regain trust, that we want to change that and address those failings. We need to show that we're determined to give the public what they have the right to expect, which is not least to be treated with respect and consideration. We've long boasted in this country that our standards of governance were beyond reproach. But recent inquiries tell a different story. They speak sometimes of a system which is excessively defensive and reluctant to learn the lessons of failure. That has to change.
I remember the flames at Grenfell Tower, but the building and development industry that allowed the cladding scandal to happen is as profitable as ever. Now, clearly, I don't blame the new government for this, but they have to deal with it. We have scandals, we have inquiries, we have taxpayers picking up the bill for compensation, but those responsible at the heart of those scandals get to keep their money and rarely face jail time.
I'd like to pay tribute to my predecessor, Royston Smith. Royston fought in Parliament for those constituents affected by the cladding scandal over the years, and I hope to carry on his important work. And party politics aside, I was touched to receive a very gracious letter from him, congratulating me and offering some wise words of advice. I think it's a measure of the man.
I'd like to record my thanks to my immediate predecessor, Stephen McPartland. I'm not sure how much I have in common with him, apart from our shared birthday and our height, or lack of. But what I do know is that when he cared deeply about a matter, he was a tenacious advocate for it, including notably being a champion of those affected by the cladding crisis following the awful Grenfell fire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In just over a month, Phase 2 of the Grenfell Inquiry will report, and there'll be implications, obviously, for the entire government. But can I ask what preparations are already being made ahead of the report, and can the Minister commit to engage with the bereaved survivors and affected community before the government responds in full to those recommendations?
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for this question. I know this is an issue close to his heart, and it's an issue close to my heart. The publication will mark its important milestone for the Grenfell community, and Parliament will have the opportunity to give its full and proper scrutiny to the issues deserved. But as the honourable friend has mentioned, it's important that bereaved families are also part of that process, and we'll be working very closely with MHCLG to make sure all those residents are properly part of this process. The government will do everything possible to drive the change to ensure that lessons are learned and that a tragedy like the fire at Grenfell Tower can never happen again.